Hey, welcome back to MobilityWOD. Today we have a special guest and a topic about a recent phenomenon we witnessed. So we just came back from the CrossFit Games where Carson was hot. It was very hot, and the field was hot. Now, what we noticed was that there are many great athletes there, many great athletes that maybe didn't have a history of competing in the heat. And what we saw was nearly 11 athletes, I think, had IVs. We saw a lot of heat stress. I think we saw people lose compression. Now, the thing about this is not putting any onus on anyone, but to try to explain away or try to talk about best practice around heat preparation. Now, these are not the first athletes who've ever competed in a very, very hot event or a multiple-day hot event. And what we want to do is bring on a couple of our expert friends who have significant experience training in heat and significant experience training athletes in heat and preparing those athletes for those heat conditions. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Brian McKenzie of Unscared Inc., the founder of CrossFit Endurance. You can see him on Athlete Cell. He was my programmer for my recent excursion on the Molokai. He's a good friend of mine. And more importantly, I think before all of this, Brian was, and still is, I would say, an extremely impressive endurance runner, and also a runner who has gone very long in some very hot conditions, including the Badwater racing himself and pacing people, which is a marathon or an ultra marathon through the hottest place in the continental United States. So, Brian, welcome. Thank you so much. We just want to pick your brain about not necessarily what we saw, a little bit maybe, but just an after-action report and to say, hey, how do I as an athlete prepare for the heat? So, Brian McKenzie, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's start with, I saw athletes shirts off, and I have to be honest, I've never seen anyone run the Badwater with the shirt off. I don't see people compete multiple stages shirts off. I didn't see hats. I didn't see towels draped over the head. I saw sort of a casual approach to the heat, and especially the aggregated heat over several days. Did you see the same?
Yeah, and you're not gonna, it's interesting, but let's just back up a second for what you just did. You did the Molokai, which was, you went from Molokai to Oahu. It was 32 miles or so, 50 kilometers roughly, 52 kilometers. That was not a cold event, and although you were in the ocean, it was something that a lot of people don't realize. Well, just because you're on water doesn't mean you have water, So there are hydration factors that were involved with what you did, and were you ever completely exposed to the elements?
No. In fact, if I just look at you guys on the boat, you had head to toe a white, yes, cover up, just exposing your face. And I wore a shirt and a hat backwards so that I could protect myself from the sun.
Yeah, and so sunscreen can fall into these categories. Although I'm not a big proponent of sunscreen any longer, but covering up is very important because the radiation from the sun and everything that's happening with the heat, your body absorbs. So if you can get the clothing on top to cut that absorption process, that's a very important thing, but it's not something that's thought of, especially in an event with CrossFit and what we saw. And this has nothing to do, like you said, with CrossFit. It's more or less the preparation. And I think because we're still in the infancy of this sport and it's evolving, that we're starting to figure out these best practices. Like we hit walls with certain things, and like a few years ago it was swimming. Like we hit some serious walls, and now everybody knows they're going to have to swim when they get to the CrossFit Games, regardless of what that swim is going to entail, whether it's in the ocean, in a pool, or whatever. They're going to have to do it. That's, so we're going to see an evolution. But I think that what's been missed is the not understanding that 100 degrees can really affect you in a very bad way.
Well, in tradition, I think I've been maybe 200 CrossFit gyms, 300 gyms at least, right? I know you've been to just as many, and I see people engage in short, intense bout, even going 20 or 30 minutes, shirt off, sweating, but then it's done. A lot of people have said, hey, they were talking about should we do this workout called Murph in the heat, which was a mile, some calisthenics, and then another mile, which is about 30-40 minute effort only. And I know that people had a weight vest on. But that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Like it doesn't.
Yeah.
I want to be clear. I don't think that that's a programming problem at all. I think it was athletes not recognizing the implications of the heat on that and what that potentially would do to them.
So that's an interesting point, and Dr. Rhonda Patrick has talked about this because of daily practices that she does, and one of those things is she gets in the sauna, and she gets in there and she's talked about the heat shock proteins that occur in the sauna. And anybody who's been in the heat or a sauna, and that moment where you start to get claustrophobic or it's almost too much, that's when those heat shock proteins are really getting active, and it becomes that uncomfortable place. Ironically, that same thing occurs within aerobic training or endurance, and that these places that we hit along that way, so the better aerobically inclined you can be, the easier it is for you to adapt to heat. Okay.
So, wait, let me just. I want to parse that out. So two things. One is that I just heard you say constant and regular exposure to high temperatures when I know I'm going to be in high temperatures acts as a prophylaxis. It does protect me. Two, that the more I can shift my workload to an aerobic workload, not an anaerobic workload, not a superlactic workload. That's the other piece that I'm hearing you say. Is that true?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, because it's within that anaerobic or the aerobic structure where you're on the higher end of that aerobic threshold, where we see the uncomfortability. Like, we could start you for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and you're fine, but it's right past that, which is right where you're switching out of like slow glycolysis into that 20-minute range into beta oxidation, where we start to have to develop these points to where we can handle the ability to be out there at those efforts. That is the same, a lot of that same stuff that's going on physiologically is happening within just doing some heat training. So if you've got an athlete who's doing some endurance training, but they haven't been exposed to heat enough, then the idea is, and there's simple ways. There are saunas everywhere, and you could start off, if it really only takes about 2 weeks to adapt to the heat, whereas it takes about 3 months to adapt to the cold. Ironically, though, once you've adapted to cold, you can adapt to heat. Very, very easy. It's an easy switch over.
I know for a fact you spend a lot of time in an ice tub, and you spend a lot. You even have an ice tank at home, and you also have an infrared sauna at home. I mean, this is not a practice that you're just saying, hey, casually, theoretically you should expose yourself to some heat. But you're saying, look, if you know you're going to compete, there are ways for you to have this exposure so that your body is not freaked out.
Very simple.
Those athletes were wearing a plate in front of them and a plate behind them, which means that they didn't even consider that they were also making it more difficult to block heat. What would you have done with your athletes? What could have been done? Could we talk about just some easy steps for someone to say, hey, I'm running, or I'm going to be exposed to this heat and I'm not prepared because I don't have a sauna. Are there steps we could take to cool our temperatures down as we train?
Yeah. One, I think that the acclimation period is probably off with a lot of these athletes. A simple way to do it is to go sit in a sauna, and when you find that breaking point, which is the place where you're super uncomfortable and want to get out, it's that simple. That's where that is. Find out where that is, get out, and then the next day get back in and see if you can push for 5 more minutes. And just continue that process for about 2 weeks, and within that 2-week period, you will see a massive change in physiology. And do yourself a favor: wear a heart rate monitor and watch what happens. As the heat goes up and the stress goes up, the heart rate will go up, and then you'll hit a point when you get into that 2-week range, somewhere right in there, where that heart rate will just literally drop out. And your body just goes, okay. And that's where the sweat rate starts to pick up, hydration. You start to become more aware that you're going to probably need to start hydrating a little further because of the heat. Those are suggestions for athletes that don't or can't get out soon enough into California. Another idea is that, hey, you should probably be headed out to somewhere that's pretty hot several weeks in advance. Get very comfortable at being uncomfortable in the heat. Then bring yourself into a situation where you're at 90 or 100 degrees versus 100 or 110.
Would you have, it seems to me, my understanding of, a lot of the gear or a lot of the apparel that people are wearing is that, that gets a little bit wet, and then it causes some evaporation. And so it actually can cool myself down. Like, I think, is that a significant aspect? Obviously, blocking UV is a big deal, and blocking just the direct infrared. I mean, maybe I can block that, maybe I can't. But
yeah, there's actually,
if I can cool off through some evaporation, it seems like that's what all these wicking things are for. It's about moving water out, and then also just creating an environment where I can dump. I mean, even cold water on top of that. I mean, I'd paddle up to you, you'd hand me some cold water that would change my life.
yes,
And then I'd be able to just cool myself down a little bit. My shirt would stay wet, and then I would just be able to motor. And motoring in a wet shirt was really amazing.
The rumor was when Scott Jurek broke the record for bad water, which I think was in the 24-hour realm, that he figured out his little super secret was the fact he had this coffin that had ice in it, and he would dose himself in that several times throughout the day. Just literally go crash into it and sit there for 3 minutes and then, or whatever, and then come out and go. So that is exactly those types of things you do want. But you also have to keep in mind that if you have wicking clothing on and you're not, and you're in a desert environment or something where it's not humid, but fortunately it was humid enough in California at the time, you don't pay attention to things like that, and you think because you don't see the sweat, you're not losing water. That is the difference between a desert and a tropical environment, where we actually have a more tropical environment going on here right now, which is something that, it's just something I'm very aware of because of watching surf and stuff like that, but that you're going to sweat a ton and know it in a humid environment. You are not going to sweat a ton or wick things. Things will evaporate very quickly in a dry environment.
So you can't even tell if you're.
You can't even tell. Like things like going through Death Valley in the middle of summer, you don't really realize how bad you're sweating. It's just gone.
Good. We've talked about cooling athletes, a water bottle under the arm.
Yes.
Holding a frozen water ball in your palms. Seems like those are things that you could have done. Much less.
Cold towel
if I was engaged.
Yep.
Cold towel on the neck, full of ice.
Yep.
It seemed like if I was doing 300 air squats, I could have put a towel on my head, soaked it, and just done air squats with a towel on my head. Am I missing that? Is that something that could have been done?
No, spot on. The holding on to things in your hand will literally change everything, because that cold water or cold thing you're holding on to, that blood that is getting cold is being shot straight to the core. So, or even under the armpits, because we've got the big arteries underneath the armpit, and we've got all this stuff underneath the on the rib cage or around the neck. You've got the big arteries and veins going through the neck, which you cool those off, those send to the core to cool it down, versus where it's getting heat exposure, especially with something like a vest on. So these are just simple things that can be fixed for athletes that aren't really thinking about stuff like this. It's trial and error, and we've been doing this for quite a while, for a little over a decade. So it's not new to us, but maybe some things we should have gotten out a little earlier.
Last idea. If I know I can push 2 or 3 hours, I don't have to drink necessarily much, right? Maybe it's hot, I don't have to push.
Yeah.
But multiple events, does that change my hydration idea or having to extend? Because I think sometimes we get confused that, hey, look, the research is that if I'm blowing it out for a single event, I don't necessarily have to monitor the hydration to 2 hours, around 2 hours, if I'm an elite marathon, or all the reasons that people were drinking way too much water. But if I'm not paying attention, how did you guys manage the hydration at plus 20 hours in the desert? What is the protocol around that?
It's literally setting up a protocol for understanding somebody's sweat rate or the amount that they're dumping. But true to what you said, the single event under 4 hours. Look, if you think you need to drink a gallon of water in that, you're just ruin yourself.
That's ridiculous.
The multiple events throughout a day, you're sweating, you're needing to recover, you're going through whatever you're going through between workouts trying to recover, and you've got to get things back, and you've also got to replace those electrolytes. So that's the key, where you're getting those things that literally makes, the electrolytes are the glue. of the water. If you don't have the electrolytes, you don't have glue. The water just goes through you. There's no cellular hydration. It dumps out. You pee it out or you sweat it out immediately. Okay, so the idea is that you understand what that is, and so setting up protocols for things like that, where somebody's out there for 30+ hours, is understanding that, okay, we've gone about an hour and he's barely drinking. I mean, I had a guy who literally would tell me he wasn't thirsty, and he didn't need any water, and we were literally going on 90 minutes to 2 hours, and he's, you know, probably 15 hours into the race, you know, and we started at 6 a.m. or 8 a.m. in the morning in bad water, where the epicenter of Death Valley, and you just get to a point when you get dehydrated where you just actually, you're no longer thirsty.
No, thirsty.
You're hungry. You're no longer thirsty, and you start to hallucinate, and this is where things get bad.
And I want to point out, it's hot, so hot that you ran on the white lines because your shoes would melt. I mean, that's that hot.
Yeah, that's what they do out there, because, you know, at 130 degrees, 120, 130 degrees, the radiating heat coming off of the asphalt is roughly around 180 to 200. So
madness. This is why, you know, I feel like best practices have been set up in other sports, especially some of these, you know, big runs, you know, plus some calisthenics. You know, it's like, you know, roughly maybe 20 minutes of running, 20 plus minutes of calisthenics. I mean, that's not true. 15 minutes of running probably. But, you know, the issue is that, you know, I think there were just opportunities there that we have to incorporate this into this nascent sport where people are really, really good and very, very competent and skilled and have big aerobic engines but weren't used to competing in that heat. And I would want to make clear that, you know, I don't think this is a programming problem on the heat. I thought this was a athlete preparedness problem.
It's absolutely an athlete preparedness problem, especially with CrossFit. That's, you know, whatever. I mean, the definition of CrossFit is throwing whatever they can throw at you at any time, and you need to adapt and figure that out. And so, being an athlete, you should probably figure, you know, knowing you're going to be in California, I'd probably be watching, you know, the weather patterns prior to coming out and saying, okay, you know, or if I've been out before, I do know it's hot in California in July.
Let me ask you this: Do you think wearing a hat while running is a bad idea? A white reflective hat?
No. In fact, they make clothing that actually is UV protected, so that literally the sun's exposure does not get through the clothing. That's the stuff you'll see out in bad water.
There it is, Brian. Sounds like, you know, I need to make sure I'm watching my electrolytes, that I'm getting some regular heat exposure. I mean, that's part of my deal. And, you know, taking those opportunities to cool my body down, you know, making sure that, you know, there are places where I can drop my core temperature. You know, that seems like it's not a single event or a single factor, but it's multifactorial. And that, you know, sometimes people are caught a little flat-footed. And remember, this is the same problem we have with our soldiers in austere environments, who have to go tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And this is why we can't just put a single effort, blow it out, use the marathon as the example. We have to use the heptathlon as the example.
Yes, 100% right. It's not just about a marathon. It's about multiple.
Multiple marathons.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian McKenzie, where can we find out about your writing and your thinking about all this? Where is that?
Go to unscared.com. That'll direct you to everything that's going on. We've now got a landing page for it, and that kind of pushes out everything, whether it's going to be 3Fuel related, or it's going to be CrossFit endurance related, or it's going to be, you know, athlete cell related. It'll all be off of unscared.com. You have
a New York Times bestselling book talking about your training programs and protocols. What's that called?
Unbreakable Runner, and then the first one I wrote was Power Speed Endurance.
Hey, love you. Thanks very much, boy.
Thanks, dude.
Talk to you soon.
All right, brother.